At 3 a.m., the call came. "Maria's hurt, Vito. Badly." His goddaughter, only 8 years old, was fighting for her life in a Texas hospital. Her stepbrother, James, had pushed her too far, leaving her battered and broken. Don Vito, the Mafia Godfather of Texas, had never been one to show mercy, but to his goddaughter, he'd made a promise he intended to keep. The streets of Texas would soon know that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the wrath of the Mafia when family was at stake. Don Vito stood in the center of his darkened mansion, a sharp silhouette against the faint light spilling from the windows. The phone call still rang in his ears. Maria was his responsibility, and no one, not even her stepbrother James, would stand between him and her safety. Clad in his signature gray suit, Vito's presence alone was enough to silence a room. But tonight, it would be the sound of 50 roaring motorcycles that would shake the streets of Texas. The mob would take over the city to ensure Maria was safe. Their mission was clear: protect her at all costs, and nothing would stop them. Vito stood in the center of his mansion, the weight of the phone call still fresh in his mind. The world outside seemed distant, as though nothing mattered but the promise he'd made all those years ago. His goddaughter, Maria, was in danger, and that was all that mattered now. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he stared out into the empty night. In the grand room, the air was thick with tension. One by one, the men filed in, their faces grim, understanding the gravity of the situation. Diesel, the club president, stood first, his large frame casting a shadow against the ornate wallpaper. His eyes, usually so calm and collected, were hard as steel. Next came Marcus, a former lawyer turned trusted confidant, his hand resting on the briefcase that contained the legal paperwork for whatever battle lay ahead. Then came Maven, an old soldier, as tough as they come, his 73 years worn like a badge of honor. "Where are we headed, Vito?" Diesel asked, his voice low, but the urgency was unmistakable. Vito took a long, slow breath, his gaze hardening. "We're going to protect Maria. She's more than just a goddaughter to me. She's family, and I don't care who stands in the way. Not James, not anyone." The room fell silent. The Mafia men, all with their own histories, their own grudges, understood the weight of his words. This wasn't just another job. This was personal. James isn't just any man. He's her stepbrother, and he thinks he can control her because of who he is. But he's made a mistake, Vito continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "I promised her father, my brother, Jake, that I would keep her safe, and I failed him." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "But I won't fail Maria." The men exchanged glances. They had all seen the cold side of Vito, the side that ruled with iron will and power. But in this moment, there was something different. Vito wasn't just the godfather. He was a man bound by the deepest loyalty, one who would stop at nothing to fulfill a promise made long ago. Diesel nodded, understanding the weight of the vow. "How many we bringing, boss?" "All of us," Vito said without hesitation. "Everyone who can ride, and anyone willing to stand with us." The Steel Wolves had always been more than just a club. They were a family. And in that moment, each member knew what they had to do. Marcus stepped forward, a stack of legal documents in hand. "I'll make sure we have the legal ground to stand on. I'll have the papers filed for custody, but this isn't just about law, is it? This is about right and wrong." Vito nodded. "Exactly. I don't care about the law when it comes to my family. I'm going to protect Maria, and no one, not even James, is going to stop me." One by one, the men, all hardened in their own ways, stepped forward. "We're with you, Vito," Maven said, his voice steady as always. Vito's gaze softened just for a moment before he turned to face the door. "Then let's move. We're riding at dawn." The sound of 50 engines roaring to life was not just a sign of power, it was a declaration. a declaration that Maria was under Vito's protection, and nothing would break the bonds of loyalty that tied the steel wolves together. Nothing would stand in their way. Dawn was barely breaking when Vito and his crew rode out of the city. The air was thick with dust and the hum of 50 engines cutting through the morning stillness. The steel wolves, a pack bound by loyalty and blood, moved in perfect formation, their bikes roaring like a distant storm. Vito's mind was focused, every thought centered on one thing: Maria. The promise he'd made to her father, the promise he'd broken for too long, now pressed down on him like the weight of the world. He couldn't fail her again. Diesel rode beside him, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. "You're sure he's in Albuquerque?" Diesel asked, his voice cutting through the headset. His eyes were scanning the road ahead, alert as ever. Vito's gaze never wavered from the road. "James will be there. He thinks he's untouchable because of his badge, but I'll show him that blood and loyalty run deeper than any uniform." The rest of the pack followed in tight formation, their bikes weaving in and out with effortless precision. Maven, Snake, and the others kept close, their eyes sharp, always scanning for any threat. This wasn't just a ride to a hospital, it was a war march, and they knew it. Hours into the ride, the first sign of trouble came in the form of a black SUV that appeared on the horizon, following them at a distance. Vito's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to ask to know who it was. James had sent his own people to track them. "Got company," Diesel muttered, his voice low. "James's boys are trailing us." Vito didn't flinch. "Let them come. We'll handle it the same way we handle everything, with family." The SUV slowly crept closer, but it wasn't the car that worried Vito. It was the man behind the wheel. James was clever, manipulative, and now he was trying to play his hand. Vito had been waiting for this moment, but he wasn't about to give James the satisfaction of a confrontation on the road. He wasn't going to let James dictate their pace. Vito pulled ahead, signaling to Diesel and the others. "Take the side road up ahead. We'll split them off. Keep the convoy moving." With practiced efficiency, the group veered off the main highway, their bikes disappearing into the wild expanse of Texas desert. The black SUV followed, but it wasn't prepared for the sudden change in direction. It swerved, trying to keep up, but the pack had already gained the advantage. Vito's heart pounded as he heard the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. They were in unfamiliar terrain now, but the mob was unbothered. They knew how to fight when necessary. They knew how to survive. James's crew wasn't ready for this kind of warfare, the kind where the rules didn't apply. As the SUV struggled to catch up, Vito knew they had to end this before it escalated. With a quick glance to Diesel, he nodded. Diesel immediately pulled out ahead, cutting off the road to create a blockade. The SUV came to a halt just a few feet away, its headlights glaring into the rear view. The windows rolled down slowly, and Vito saw two of James's men staring out. Vito's gaze met theirs, cold, unwavering. He stepped off his bike and approached the vehicle. "You're out of your depth here," he said, his voice steady. One of the men smirked, but his eyes betrayed the uncertainty beneath. "James won't like this. You think you can just take his sister?" Vito leaned in closer. "I'm not taking her. I'm keeping her safe, and that's something James will never understand." The tension crackled in the air, but Vito wasn't about to let them escalate. With a sharp motion, he gestured to his men. "Let's go. This isn't worth our time." Without a word, the Mafia roared back to life, their bikes shaking the dust from the desert floor. The SUV, once a threat, now just a shadow in their rear-view mirrors. Vito turned his gaze forward, the road to Albuquerque ahead. He wasn't just driving toward a destination. He was driving toward justice, and nothing, not even James or his crooked allies, would stand in his way. Vito's Harley rolled to a stop outside the sterile, cold facade of the Albuquerque Police Department. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. His crew dismounted in silence, each man knowing what came next. Vito adjusted his suit jacket, the weight of the promise pressing down on him with every step he took toward the building. The steel wolves flanked him, as they always did, but even in their loyalty, there was an unspoken tension in the air. They were about to confront the very system that protected James, the system that had allowed him to hide behind his badge for so long. As Vito entered the building, the familiar hum of authority and bureaucracy washed over him. He wasn't a stranger to this place. His influence ran deep in the underbelly of the city. A few whispered names, a few calls, and the right doors opened. But today, he wasn't here to make deals. He was here to make a statement. "Vito," came the sharp voice of Captain Monroe as he walked into the precinct, his expression unreadable. "What brings you here?" Vito held his ground, his eyes locking onto the captain's. Monroe, a tall, broad-shouldered man with years of service behind him, was a veteran of the system. He knew the game, knew it all too well, and he also knew that when Vito came knocking, things were about to change. "I'm here for Maria," Vito said, his voice low but firm. "Her stepbrother's abusing her, and I'm not leaving until you do something about it." Monroe's face flickered with something unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "I know you've got your connections, Vito, but this is police business now, not mafia business." The words hung in the air like smoke. Vito could feel the tension between them, the underlying distrust. The captain knew what Vito's world was like. He knew the kind of power the mafia wielded in this town, but this was different. Vito wasn't here to make a profit, wasn't here to spin a web of influence. This was personal, and it was about to get ugly. "James is a cop," Vito continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "But that doesn't mean he's untouchable. You've got the power to remove him from that hospital, to protect Maria. I'm asking you to do your job." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "We can't just go arrest him without evidence. I'm sure you know that." Vito's gaze hardened. "I don't care about evidence. What I care about is that Maria is safe. What I care about is keeping a promise I made to her father, and if I have to bend every law in the book to do it, I will." There was a long pause before Monroe spoke again. "You know we can't let the mafia run the show. If we move on this, you're going to cause more problems than you're solving." Vito's fingers curled into a fist, but he remained composed. "You're telling me to wait. You're telling me to let Maria go back to that man, to wait for paperwork, for red tape. That's not how this works, Monroe." Monroe stood, his hands resting on the desk, his eyes flashing with frustration. "I don't like this, Vito. I don't like the way this is going. You're pushing too hard. You're making enemies." Vito took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't care who I make enemies with. I'm not leaving here until Maria is safe. And if you're not going to help me, I'll make sure James doesn't make it another day in that uniform. It's your call." The room fell silent. Vito could see the gears turning in Monroe's mind, the struggle between law and loyalty, between keeping the peace and doing what was right. But Vito wasn't going to wait for the system to decide. He'd already made up his mind. "Call your shots, Captain," Vito said, his tone final. "But don't make me do it for you." Monroe's face darkened. "I'll see what I can do." Vito gave a single nod, then turned and walked out of the room, his crew following in his wake. The tension in the precinct was palpable, but Vito didn't care. The wheels were already in motion. He wasn't just the godfather of the Mafia. He was the protector of Maria. And this fight, he'd win. The courthouse was cold, its walls heavy with history and the weight of secrets. The air was thick with tension as Vito walked into the courtroom, his sharp suit standing out among the more subdued attire of the others. He wasn't here for a legal battle. He was here to ensure that Maria's truth was heard. He couldn't rely on the slow-moving gears of justice. He had already learned that lesson too many times. Today, he would make sure the system did what it was supposed to do, or he would make them. Vito's gaze found Maria, sitting nervously between her grandparents in the front row. She was small, her legs swinging nervously beneath her, a faint bruise still visible on her cheek. The sight of her, broken but still here, pushed something raw to the surface. Maria was a child, and she was scared. But that fear, he could feel it too, and it was his fault. James was sitting across the courtroom, looking every bit the picture of authority in his police uniform, his eyes cold, calculating. Vito could feel the menace radiating from him, a man who thought he could get away with anything because of who he was. But Vito wasn't the kind of man to sit back and watch someone use their power to destroy a life. The judge entered, and the room stood. The murmurs quieted. As the gavel came down, the proceedings began. But Vito barely heard the formalities. His mind was on Maria, on the danger that still lurked with James standing so close. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. He had to make a move. Maria's testimony was scheduled first. Her voice, barely audible, quivered as she took the stand, her small form swallowed by the oversized chair. She held her hands tightly together, her knuckles white from the strain. Every word she spoke was an unbearable truth. A truth that hung in the air, waiting to rip the facade James had built around himself apart. "I didn't mean to," Maria whispered, looking down at her hands, her voice trembling. "He told me I was bad, that I made my mom leave. He said I was a burden." Vito's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every word that came from her lips was a punch to his gut. How had he let this happen? The lawyer, a slick figure with a sharp smile, attempted to twist her words, trying to paint Maria as a confused child who didn't understand the reality of what had happened. But Vito saw through it. This wasn't confusion. It was fear, and it was a fear he had sworn to erase from her life. The lawyer asked Maria to explain the night she was hurt, and with the slightest nod from Vito, she began again, her voice shaking but clear. She described how James had grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back, how he shoved her against the table, and how she had fallen, her ribs cracking as she hit the sharp edge. She described the way he threatened her when she begged for help, how he told her that if anyone found out, no one would believe her. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. Even James had stopped looking so confident, his face pale, his fingers twitching at his side. Vito saw the cracks in his armor. Maria's words had chipped away at his defense. Vito couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't a courtroom drama," he said, his voice low and steady, but filled with an undeniable power. "This is real. This girl's life is at stake, and I'm done waiting for the law to make things right." The room went still. Vito's eyes never left James as he made his way to the front, the eyes of the room following him, some with fear, some with respect. He had no intention of letting James walk away from this, not while Maria's life hung in the balance. The lawyer sputtered, trying to regain control, but Vito's voice drowned him out. "I'll handle this. You're too late." Vito turned back to Maria, his eyes softening as he knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he whispered, a promise. "No one's taking you anywhere. Not ever again." James could try to hide behind his badge, but Vito was done playing by the rules. This fight was about family, and nothing was more important than that. The streets of Texas had never felt so quiet, yet so dangerous. Vito's convoy rolled through the heart of the city, 50 bikes roaring in perfect unison, their engines thundering like a storm gathering on the horizon. The city's skyline loomed ahead, but there was no mistaking the sheer presence of the Mafia as it descended. The steel wolves weren't just in the streets, they owned them now. Vito sat at the head of the pack, his black Harley gleaming under the harsh midday sun. Diesel rode close behind. As always, the weight of the mission pressing down on both of them. This was no longer just about protecting Maria. This was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could abuse their power. Maria's safety was the priority, but the fight was escalating, and Vito knew it wouldn't be long before James made his move. The streets were lined with parked cars and the occasional bystander, their gazes following the mob as it made its way through town. The crowd parted without a word, but Vito could feel the whispers. The Mafia had arrived, and there was no escaping it. The pack took over the streets with the quiet authority of men who had made promises they intended to keep, no matter the cost. As they approached the hospital where Maria was being held, the mood shifted. The rumble of the engines, the smell of gas and leather filled the air. The Mafia was here, and they weren't going anywhere. "We'll park across the street," Diesel called, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. "Keep a low profile until we know what we're dealing with." Vito nodded, his eyes scanning the building. The hospital was still and quiet, but he knew better. James wasn't the type to sit back and let things unfold without a fight. He had a badge, a reputation, and a twisted sense of entitlement. Vito had no doubt that James would try to make a move soon. He just didn't know how or when. The pack split into smaller groups, taking positions around the hospital, their presence not just physical but strategic. Every entry point was covered, every exit watched. Vito's men were ready. And they weren't just here to guard Maria. They were here to make sure that no one, least of all James, could get to her. But Vito wasn't prepared for what happened next. From across the street, he saw a black SUV pull up to the hospital entrance, the tinted windows hiding the driver's face. Vito's heart skipped a beat. He knew that car. He knew James was inside. "We've got movement," Vito muttered, his voice low and dangerous. He signaled Diesel, who immediately moved to position himself at the back entrance. "I'll take care of it," Diesel said, already moving with the fluidity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Vito stayed put, watching the SUV with a sharp eye. He could feel the tension thickening in the air, like the calm before a storm. James wasn't just going to waltz in and take Maria. This was his last chance, and Vito wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of victory. Not while he had the streets and the pack on his side. The door to the SUV swung open, and out stepped James, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the area. Vito's blood boiled as he watched the man walk with a sense of entitlement, as if the city, and everyone in it, belonged to him. But Vito wasn't about to let that happen. "Not today," Vito muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening on the handlebars. The wolves were ready, and when the fight came, they'd make sure James knew exactly who owned the streets of Texas. The night was unusually quiet, the air heavy with the weight of decisions that had already been made. Vito sat alone in his black leather chair, the lights from the street lamps outside casting long, jagged shadows through the windows. The muffled hum of the city barely reached him, but his mind was loud with thoughts he couldn't silence. His eyes were fixed on the framed photo of Maria's father on the desk, Jake Morrison. The promise he'd made to Jake echoed in Vito's mind, a promise he had been unable to keep, one that had cost Maria far more than it should have. He had failed her. "I'm sorry, brother," Vito muttered to the empty room. His fingers traced the edge of the frame, the glass cold against his skin. "I promised I'd protect her, and I didn't. I let him slip through my fingers. I let her fall." Jake had died far too young, his last words still burning in Vito's memory. "Promise me, Vito. Promise me you'll look after Sarah and the baby." Vito had promised, of course, but promises were easier said than kept. He hadn't known then how hard it would be. He hadn't known how much Maria would need him, or how much he would fail her. Back then, he had been busy with the family business, with the Mafia's constant demands. He had convinced himself that Maria was safe, that her mother would keep her from harm, that James, a man with a badge, would be a protector. But Vito knew now, sitting in the silence of his office, that he had been naive. James hadn't been the protector he thought he was. He had been the predator all along, and Maria, alone, had suffered for it. The guilt ate at him. Every second of every day he had spent away from her, thinking that she was fine, thinking that someone else was watching over her. His mind kept going back to that night in the hospital when he'd first heard the news. The moment he realized that, for all his power, for all his control, he had failed at the one thing that truly mattered. "You should have been there," Vito said aloud, his voice raw. "I should have been there." He closed his eyes, the image of Maria's small face, tear-streaked, bruised, terrified, flashing in his mind. The way she had looked at him when he entered the hospital room, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She had been waiting for him to save her, and yet he had let her down. Vito leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his face in his hands. The guilt, the anger, it was suffocating. How many more people would I fail before it was all over? He wondered. The Mafia, the power, the wealth. None of it meant anything if he couldn't protect the ones who needed him the most. The sound of the door opening behind him broke his reverie. Diesel stepped inside, his face grim, his presence always enough to pull Vito back into reality. "We're ready when you are," Diesel said softly. Vito nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the chair. The time for reflection was over. It was time to make things right. It was time to prove that promises, even the ones that had been broken, could still be kept. "Let's finish this," Vito said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We ride tonight." The past was behind him now. Maria needed him, and he wasn't going to fail her again. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Vito and his crew rode into the heart of Albuquerque. The city's skyline loomed ahead, its lights flickering like distant stars, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The sound of 50 bikes roaring through the streets was deafening, but beneath that, there was a silence that weighed heavily on Vito. He had come too far to back down now. They rolled into position near the hospital, engines dying as they came to a halt, and the steel wolves dismounted with practiced precision. Vito's eyes flicked toward the hospital entrance, where James had parked his black SUV earlier, his men likely already inside, waiting. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of red and purple, but Vito's focus was singular. Tonight, everything changed. "We've got company," Diesel muttered, nodding toward a group of men in suits standing at the entrance of the building. Their expressions were cold, unreadable, but Vito recognized them for what they were. Powerful men who thought they were untouchable. Corruption ran deep in the veins of this town, and James had planted himself right at the center of it all. Vito's jaw tightened, the old rage burning in his chest, mixing with something deeper. This wasn't just about Maria anymore. This was about righting the wrongs, about bringing the fight to those who had twisted the rules to suit their own needs. He wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Not tonight. "Remember, we're here to keep her safe," Vito said to his men, his voice steady, though the fury behind his words was palpable. "No one goes inside unless they've got a reason, and we stand our ground." The men nodded in unison, their faces hardening as they lined up behind him. Vito could feel their loyalty, the unspoken bond that had kept them together all these years. No matter what happened next, they were with him, just as they always had been. Then, through the doors of the hospital, came James, flanked by a handful of officers, his expression smug. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who thought he could do no wrong, but tonight that arrogance would be his downfall. Vito's eyes narrowed as James stepped onto the sidewalk, his gaze locking onto Vito's from across the street. The tension between them was electric, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. James wasn't the only one watching him. The men in suits shifted slightly, clearly aware of the impending confrontation. The pieces were all in place, but it wasn't just James they were up against. It was the entire system of power that had enabled him to get away with everything. "Move in," Vito ordered, his voice low but filled with authority. Without hesitation, the steel wolves moved, flanking James and his men as they took their positions, surrounding them with the kind of calm intensity that only years of loyalty could forge. The night air seemed to hum with the weight of what was coming. James sneered, his hand twitching near his belt as if to reach for his gun. But Vito was faster, stepping forward with a predatory grace that sent a chill down everyone's spine. "You're done, James," Vito said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This isn't your game anymore." James's eyes flickered with uncertainty, his bravado faltering. "You think you can just walk in here with your thugs and take what's mine?" "Maria isn't yours," Vito said coldly, stepping closer. "And neither is this town. You've been hiding behind that badge long enough. Now it's time for the truth to come out." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The men in suits moved subtly, but Vito's crew was ready. They had made their move, and nothing was going to stop them. James's smug expression faltered as he glanced around at the 50 Mafia men standing tall, unflinching. His eyes flickered to the officers beside him, but even they hesitated. "You're outnumbered, James," Diesel called out from the side. "You know it, I know it." Vito stepped forward again, his gaze never leaving James. "There's no escape this time. It's over." And in that moment, as the weight of his words sank in, the world seemed to hold its breath. Vito wasn't just taking on James, he was taking on the entire system that had let men like him walk free for too long. And tonight, that system was about to crumble. A single step forward, a nod from Vito, and the Mafia moved as one, their presence undeniable. James was trapped, and he knew it. His empire was crumbling, piece by piece. Tonight, the truth would finally win. The air was heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation, the streets eerily silent now that the storm had passed. Vito stood outside the hospital, his gaze fixed on the quiet building. The distant sound of sirens echoed faintly, but they were not for him. Not anymore. He had made sure of that. His men, the steel wolves, had kept their word, and now, as the adrenaline of the standoff began to fade, Vito could feel the weight of the night settling over him. Maria was safe. For the first time in far too long, she was free from the shadow of her stepbrother. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. James had been arrested, and the legal side of things was already in motion, but Vito knew the road to peace wasn't as simple as a victory on the streets. He walked over to where Maria's grandparents waited, their faces etched with relief, but still holding traces of worry. Carol, Maria's grandmother, stood up as Vito approached, her eyes searching his face, trying to read the truth in his expression. Bill, her husband, remained seated, his hand resting heavily on the arm of the chair. "She's inside, right?" Carol asked, her voice soft but laced with an undercurrent of fear. Vito nodded. "She's inside, with the best doctors in the city. We'll make sure she's taken care of." There was no question of leaving now. Vito had made sure James wouldn't get to her again, but the aftermath of abuse ran deep, and it would take more than a few hours in a hospital to fix what had been broken. Maria needed time to heal, time to adjust, and most importantly, time to trust again. "I'm sorry," Vito said, his voice low as he met Carol's gaze. "I failed her. I promised Jake. I promised I would keep her safe, and I let her down." Carol's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You did what you could, Vito. You brought her home." Vito turned away, the weight of his guilt hanging over him like a dark cloud. He had promised Jake that he would protect Maria, and now he was watching the aftermath of what had happened while he wasn't there. But he had also promised himself that he would never fail her again. That vow had never meant more to him than it did in this moment. "I couldn't protect her before," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but I can now." He walked toward the hospital doors, his hand brushing against the cold metal of the handle. It was a small thing, but it was a step toward rebuilding what he had lost, what he had let slip through his fingers. Inside, Maria was waiting. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of her healing. As he stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold inside, he realized that protecting her wasn't just about keeping threats at bay. It was about showing her that there was more to life than fear and violence, that there was a place for love, for family, for safety. He had a long road ahead of him, not just for Maria, but for himself as well. His life had always been one of power, control, and the Mafia. But as the sounds of the hospital filled his ears, as he thought of Maria inside, Vito understood that true strength was found in the quiet moments of protection and care. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something he had buried for years: his humanity. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows across Vito's office. The city outside had begun to stir, but the stillness inside the room felt like a quiet victory. Vito sat behind his desk, the weight of the night's events slowly lifting from his shoulders. Maria was safe. She was with her grandparents now, recovering from the trauma that had threatened to tear her apart. The worst of it was over, but the journey wasn't. The Mafia world was a dark one, filled with blood and power, loyalty and betrayal. Vito had built his empire with the ruthless knowledge that it would cost him everything. He had sacrificed much to get to where he was: friendships, family, his own humanity. But as he sat there, looking at the small framed photo of Maria and Jake on his desk, he realized something. The cost had been too high. When he had first made the promise to Jake, he had thought he understood what it meant: protect her, keep her safe. But as the years passed, as he lost touch, as he got caught up in the mess of his own world, the promise had slipped from his mind. He hadn't been there for Maria when she needed him most, but now he had done what he promised. He had brought her home. The sound of footsteps brought Vito's thoughts back to the present. Diesel entered the room, his face serious as always, but with a note of relief in his eyes. "How's she doing?" Vito asked before Diesel could speak. "Better. She's with her grandparents now. They're keeping a close eye on her," Diesel replied, his voice calm but filled with an underlying sense of satisfaction. "You did it, Vito. You kept your word." Vito nodded, his fingers tapping the edge of his desk. He hadn't done it alone. The steel wolves had stood by him, every one of them loyal to the end. "It's not over yet. She still has a long way to go." "That's true," Diesel said, stepping forward and leaning against the door frame. "But she's got you now. She's got us." Vito's gaze softened. He had always seen the Mafia as a family, but it had never felt more true than it did in this moment. The loyalty they shared wasn't born from fear or power. It was something deeper. They were bound by the same code, by a bond that went beyond blood. The Steel Wolves weren't just a group of men who rode together. They were a family, and Vito had learned over the years that family didn't always mean blood. Sometimes it meant something far stronger. "I've been thinking," Vito began, his voice quieter now. "This life, the world we've built, it's not all there is. I've spent too long hiding behind it, thinking it was enough, but it's not anymore." Diesel watched him, his expression unreadable. "You're ready to leave it behind?" Vito met his gaze, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Not leave it behind, but maybe change it. For the first time, I want to build something that lasts. For Maria. For all of us." The words hung in the air, a shift in the foundation of everything Vito had ever known. The Mafia world was still his, but it didn't have to be the only world. He had seen what loyalty and love could do, what they had done for Maria, and he wasn't ready to walk away from that yet. In that moment, Vito knew he was no longer just the godfather of a crime empire. He was a protector, a man who had learned that true power came from redemption, from family, and from the promises you kept. The door to the office opened, and the rest of the pack entered, standing around him, waiting. Vito looked up at them. His family. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady, strong. "But together, we'll make it right."